Secure Rural Schools Program funding. It is essential for the continued delivery of quality education for our community and for the county as well.
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, this is in the West, it is largely, we have a lot of federally held timberland, and that the revenue that was generated off those timber sales portion went to our public services like schools, roads, law enforcement, and that's one of the reasons we used to have some of the best schools in the country was those Title III dollars. And as we started to see constrictions in timber harvesting come down in federal policy, a program called Secure Rural Schools was adopted that starts to kind of backstop some of those losses in tax revenue. And we've seen the number of dollars allocated through Secure Rural Schools just atrophy over time and get smaller and smaller and smaller. And we haven't seen a necessary reform in timber policy federally to make up for that. And so Secure Rural Schools, so here's the drama. It passed through the latest budget bill in the House. It moved to the Senate. The Senate parliamentarians stripped it out as not germane. Then the Senate passed their own standalone bill on Secure Rural Schools through unanimous consent, and that's where it stands right now, waiting for the House to again pass it a second time so that it can be signed into law. But the problem is that the Senate version only authorizes through financial year 2026. So this is just, again, it's just a smaller horizon. The last time it was authorized, it was for 3 years. And so it's just this dwindling pool of money. And we see this painfully and bitterly here. The Wind River Middle School was shut down because of this. In part, Gluesenkamp County is now down to a 4-day school week. Here in Skamania County, we're seeing bus routes consolidated. We saw a lot of paraeducated positions ended. I think about 10 paraeducator positions, as well as some of the bus routes consolidated. I mean, it's a bad situation. It is a terrible situation. And it's been really frustrating to me to see how animated and how much momentum there was behind renaming the Gulf of Mexico. And I just want geography class. I just want to know what kind of school we're going to have here in the fall. And it's every angle I can, I am bringing this up to my colleagues. I am pestering people all over the floor and just relentlessly pushing that this is real and concrete for us, and trying to really rally my other colleagues who are from states that rely on Secure Rural Schools for funding. But again, it's one of those issues where it's like there are so few members of Congress who have children in public school to begin with, and then you narrow that gap to who's on the West Coast. And so it is a battle worth fighting, and it is a battle that I am very committed to pursuing every avenue we can, because the consequences are too bitter of not pursuing that. And I'm also, I think this is an and situation, and wildfire is one of the largest contributors of CO2 in our state. We need to have sustainable harvest. We need to have reliable family wage jobs, single earner households. We need to have, everybody's working 3 jobs, right? And so many of us, Brian and I were just debating this. I heard 80%, he heard 75, or
right.
just,
Yep.
percent of employed people in our county are employed outside of the county. And that means that you're not coaching Little League. It means that you're not making it to PTA meetings. It means that you're not going to see your kids as much at night. And it's a real atrophy of community. And so when that's one of the things about the shift to the knowledge economy or the service economy. If you're trying to make a living cutting hair, a lot of times that means you're going to move to a city and you're not going to be able to own land, right? You're not going to be able to own a home as easily. When you have a mill, you've got the full integration of people, apprentices, all the way up to management and owners in the same school. There's a real asset to making things and to having a real economy of manufacturing. And so it's a fighting for SRS reauthorization with all that I've got, and also saying we need the kind of policy that has sustainable timber harvest. I was able to pass the Good Neighbor Authority expansion, which is a kind of harvesting where your heart, it's fitting, and that those dollars come back. The county is able to kind of help manage some of those sales. A lot of people will not bid on a job if it's being bid through the Forest Service as easily as they might if it's something they know at the county or the state. So every avenue we have to ensure that our natural resources, that the value of that is accruing to the public good, to real family wage jobs, to good public schools, to good infrastructure. We've got to think about this three-dimensionally here. And so that's where we're at. Thank you, Lisa. Appreciate your work so much. I deeply understand nobody runs a budget. Nobody would choose to run a budget like this with a year-to-year lack of confidence. So.
Okay, Marjorie from Stevenson asks, what are you doing and what will you do to protect the immigrant community from being terrorized indiscriminately by ICE agents in Southwest Washington?
So I think it's important that we are not demonizing law enforcement, that the accountability lies where it ought to with how it's being directed and where and to what degree. And I've made sure that my staff knows it's a priority for me. If a citizen is somehow involved in one of these, in detention, that we are proactively reaching out to families as much as possible to make sure they know about our casework opportunities and really pursuing that. We have not gotten any engagement on that. The numbers are relatively low in Southwest Washington on ICE engagement. I think it's also, it's Congress's failure to act on immigration reform. I think it's a good thing. We don't want to see cartels being able to make a buck trafficking humans, and we don't want to see them trafficking fentanyl. I think it is the obligation of a country to know who and what is coming through. And Congress's failure to have comprehensive immigration reform is pushing us into more chaos and giving more agency to an executive branch that is not always it is not. We have as much agency as the executive branch, and we need to be exerting it in defense of a sane policy. My dad immigrated here from Mexico in the 70s, and looking at the ways that families' experience of the immigration system is so different depending on whether or not you have access to a lawyer. And that is not America. That is not the way it ought to be. It should not be dependent on your bank account or your last name. We need to have an immigration system that is clear and fair and prioritizing, that is efficient and quick, and not a guaranteed employment for lawyers, but is really meeting our country's needs where they're at and affirming our identity as a nation that welcomes refugees and that is honoring the dignity of humanity. So we're going to keep our ears open and eyes open and being as available as we can be. And yeah.
Next question is from John from Underwood. Can you support federal, state, county, and local law enforcement working together to get violent criminals out of our community?
Nobody wants violent criminals in our community, and I think it's really critical that one of the things that I've been pursuing, cartels, trafficking cartels, they do not recognize or they do not care about which jurisdiction they're in. And so having funding for multi-jurisdictional task forces, particularly on drug interdiction, really matters, that our law enforcement is able to communicate with each other and across departments that there's officer resources. I mean, we're on the I-5 corridor, and that means that like we need to have the resources to communicate across state boundaries, across county boundaries, between different agencies, and we also need to have resources to respond to local issues. It can't just be pursuing, chasing people on I-5. Like, we need to be able to have responses when, God forbid your house gets broken into, that the sheriff has capacity to get there. And I will say the same thing goes, this is a little bit outside of what John was talking about, but talking to the sheriff about, I think it's something like a 700% increase in the demand for search and rescue operations. So you've got a lot of kids on TikTok who do not understand what they're getting into. And they get out in the Gifford and they get lost, and that means that we have our local law enforcement tied up in the woods, often without communication access. They can maybe send a text, but they can't communicate about the condition or and that's a whole other kettle of fish. One of my early CPS earmark requests was for radio communications to have more communication, because we all know how unreliable it's the gorge, right? It's a difficult place to get cell phone reception, and so ensuring that our law enforcement has the ability to communicate with each other, that they have the agency and authority to communicate with other law enforcement. And this is becoming a particularly tough issue because you're seeing so much shift to digital communications in law enforcement, with a whole different set of communications infrastructure. And so trying to catch up and be able to communicate between counties, when one county might be on a radio system and the other county has transitioned to digital communication. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And to his question about, violent criminals, I have concerns about some of the data. I think some kinds of crime are just going underreported. If you know that they're not going to make it out there, you're not maybe going to call about illegal dumping on your property, or you're maybe not going to call about the kids doing burnouts. It doesn't mean it's not happening. It doesn't mean that we're feeling safe and secure. And so ensuring that we have that access and we have the resources to respond, and people are able to call in and get the support they need. That's a real facet. And yeah.
Next question, Dejana